The chandeliers of Lady Mansfield's ballroom cast their golden light across a sea of silks and satins, each gown more elaborate than the last, a kaleidoscope of wealth that shifted and swirled with the music drifting from the orchestra positioned in the gallery above. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of hothouse flowers, expensive perfumes, and the underlying warmth of too many bodies pressed into gilded splendor, while the June evening beyond the tall windows offered no relief, only the sultry promise of a London summer descending upon the season's endless parade of matrimonial display. It was here, in the year of our Lord 1815, with Napoleon newly vanquished and society determined to celebrate its victory with unprecedented extravagance, that Miss Eleanor Hartfield stood at the periphery of all this glittering abundance, a solitary figure in lavender silk that had once been beautiful but now bore the subtle marks of time and careful preservation. The gown had faded from its original rich purple to a softer shade, almost grey in certain lights, and though her needle had worked miracles in the seams where the fabric had begun to fray, though she had turned and re-hemmed and reinforced with a skill born of necessity, the dress could not hide what it was, a relic of better days, worn for the third year in succession to every ball her cousin's charity allowed her to attend. Eleanor herself seemed almost a part of the ballroom's architecture, positioned near a marble pillar where she could observe the dancers without being observed herself. Her gloved hands folded quietly, her dark hair dressed simply compared to the elaborate coiffures surrounding her, her only ornament a small cameo at her throat that had belonged to her mother. She was the daughter of a scholar, a man whose brilliance had earned respect but never fortune, and his death 2 years prior had left her entirely dependent upon the kindness of relatives who provided lodging and occasional entrance to society's gatherings without quite accepting her as an equal. Around her swirled the daughters of merchants and lords, each in their fresh gowns of the latest fashion, their jewels catching the candlelight, their laughter carefully modulated to attract without appearing desperate, while their mothers watched with the keen eyes of generals surveying a battlefield. Eleanor watched too, but without envy, finding in these evenings a brief escape from her daily work as companion to an elderly widow, a few hours where she could listen to music and observe the intricate dance of courtship and pretense with the same analytical eye her father had once applied to his beloved ancient texts. The music swelled, couples formed for a quadrille, and it was precisely then that a disturbance rippled through the room, like wind across water, heads turning, whispers rising, as the Duke of Ashworth was announced at the entrance, his arrival unexpected and immediately significant, for he was known to be cold, exacting, impossible to please, a man who attended perhaps 3 balls a season and had rejected every eligible woman presented to him with such cool politeness that ambitious mothers had begun to despair of ever seeing him wed. The Duke of Ashworth surveyed the ballroom with the practiced eye of a man who had long ago ceased to find entertainment in such gatherings, seeing instead only the transparent machinations of ambitious mothers and their daughters, each performance more calculated than the last. Fresh gowns displayed like plumage in an elaborate mating ritual where fortune mattered more than feeling, and connection was measured in acres and annual income rather than any meeting of minds or hearts. He had attended this evening only because his mother had insisted, because duty demanded occasional visibility in society, because absence would fuel speculation he preferred to avoid. But as he stood near the entrance watching the dancers swirl past in their pastel silks and expensive jewels, he felt the familiar weariness settle over him like a cloak, the certain knowledge that he would spend the evening deflecting transparent attempts at conversation, avoiding the predatory gazes of debutantes coached in the art of capturing titled husbands, and ultimately retiring early with relief at having fulfilled his obligation without encouraging anyone's expectations. It was then that his gaze fell upon the woman in lavender, standing alone near a marble pillar, with a stillness that set her apart from the restless energy surrounding her, and something in the worn quality of her gown caught his attention with an interest he could not immediately explain, for it was the same dress he had seen at Lady Rutherford's ball a month prior, and before that at the Countess of Worthington's musicale. The fabric faded to that particular shade that spoke of age and careful preservation rather than the bright freshness that characterized every other woman present. He found himself studying her with detached curiosity, noting the expert repairs visible only to a careful observer, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite her obvious poverty, the absence of any attempt to conceal or apologize for her circumstances, and when his hostess approached with the inevitable intention of making introductions, he did not deflect, as was his custom, but instead allowed himself to be led across the ballroom to where Miss Eleanor Hartfield stood, her cousin Lady Pemberton, making the presentations with nervous deference that he ignored, focusing instead on the woman herself as she curtsied with practiced grace and met his eyes without the simpering or calculated shyness he had come to expect. Their conversation was brief, formal, utterly proper, touching only on the weather and the quality of the music, forgettable to any observer. But he noticed that she did not apologize for her dress, did not make excuses or explanations, did not angle for his attention or attempt to prolong the exchange beyond what courtesy required, and when he bowed and moved away, he found himself unexpectedly intrigued by this woman who seemed to want nothing from him, who looked at him with neither calculation nor awe, but simply with the polite attention one gave to any stranger met in a ballroom. The evening concluded as such evenings always did, with his early departure noted and discussed, with Eleanor returning to her cousin's modest lodgings in a hired carriage, with both carrying away impressions neither could quite dismiss, though neither yet understood that this brief, unremarkable introduction had set in motion something that would transform them both. The mornings came early for Eleanor Hartfield, the pale light of dawn filtering through the thin curtains of her small room in Lady Pemberton's townhouse, waking her before the servants had fully stirred, and she would rise quietly, washing in cold water from the basin and dressing in one of her 3 serviceable day gowns, each as carefully maintained as the lavender silk, but without any pretense to beauty, practical garments for a woman whose days were spent in work rather than leisure. By 7:30 she had walked the 6 streets to Mrs. Weatherby's residence, a narrow house in an unfashionable but respectable area, where the elderly widow lived alone, save for 2 servants, and the endless procession of memories from a life that had once been full, but now existed primarily in the stories she told to anyone patient enough to listen. Eleanor's duties were simple in description but demanding in practice. She read aloud from newspapers and novels for hours, while Mrs. Weatherby's failing eyes rested. She managed correspondence with relatives who rarely visited. She provided company and conversation, and the small dignities that made the difference between loneliness and solitude, and though the work was not grand, Eleanor found in it a satisfaction that the ballrooms could never provide, the knowledge that she was useful, that her presence mattered to someone, and that honest labor had its own form of nobility, regardless of society's failure to recognize it. The evenings, when she returned to her cousin's house, were her own, and it was by candlelight in her small room that she would spread the lavender dress across her narrow bed and examine it with the critical eye of a seamstress searching for any sign of wear that might become disaster, her needle moving with practiced precision to reinforce a seam before it could split, to invisibly mend a small tear in the hem where she had stepped upon it at the last ball, and to press and smooth and coax a few more wearings from fabric that had already served far beyond its intended life. The dress had been her mother's once, sewn for a country assembly 15 years past, and after her mother's death 3 years ago, Eleanor had carefully taken it apart and remade it to fit her own slighter frame, altering the neckline to suit a more recent fashion, preserving every inch of fabric as though it were spun from memory itself, for it was the last tangible connection she possessed to a time when her father had still lived, when their modest house had been filled with books and conversation and the quiet contentment of a family that valued learning over luxury. Her father's death 2 years prior had changed everything, the debts discovered after his passing consuming what little remained, forcing Eleanor to choose between accepting offers from 2 elderly gentlemen who had made their interest clear, men of fortune seeking young companionship in exchange for security, or maintaining her independence through work and the charity of relatives, and she had chosen dignity over comfort without hesitation, though the balls she attended now through Lady Pemberton's kindness were not meant for husband hunting, but simply for those brief hours where she could listen to music and observe beauty, and remember that the world contained more than work and worry, that grace and artistry still existed even if they were not meant for her, except as a spectator. And in these small pleasures, these moments of borrowed elegance, she found a contentment that asked for nothing more than what it was. 3 weeks had passed since their first meeting when the Duke of Ashworth appeared again at Lady Castleton's ball, his presence noted with the same flutter of excitement that always accompanied his rare attendances, though he moved through the crowd with his customary air of detached observation, acknowledging greetings with minimal courtesy, while his gaze swept the ballroom with what appeared to be deliberate purpose until it settled upon Eleanor Hartfield, standing near the windows in her lavender silk, the same gown he had seen before, and now in the brighter candlelight of this particular venue he could discern what he had only suspected previously, the nearly invisible mending along one seam, and the expert way a small tear near the hem had been rewoven with such skill that only someone looking closely would notice, and he found himself considering the hours of patient work such repairs required, the pride that would choose careful preservation over replacement, or the humiliation of appearing in obviously damaged clothing. He observed her for several minutes as she conversed with an older gentleman about a recent publication, and it was this conversation that provided him with the pretext he needed, for he had read the same volume and found it surprisingly insightful, and so he approached with the formal courtesy that characterized all his interactions, waiting for a natural pause before addressing Eleanor directly with a question about her opinion of the author's central thesis, a question that could have been answered with a simple pleasantry, but which she instead met with genuine consideration, her response demonstrating not only that she had read the work carefully, but that she had formed her own conclusions independent of the critical consensus that had declared it either brilliant or derivative, depending on which journal one consulted. Their conversation evolved from literature to the philosophical questions the book had raised, topics of duty and individual conscience, the tension between societal expectations and personal conviction, and the Duke found himself increasingly engaged, despite his intention to keep the exchange brief, for Eleanor's observations were thoughtful without being pretentious, informed without being pedantic, and entirely free of the simpering agreement or calculated disagreement he had come to expect from women who spoke to him with matrimonial designs. She neither flattered his opinions nor contradicted them for effect, but simply engaged with ideas as though they mattered more than the impression she made, and when he mentioned a related work by a German philosopher, she admitted without embarrassment that she had not read it, asking if he found it worthwhile, and this, too, struck him as remarkable, this willingness to acknowledge the limits of her knowledge rather than pretending to an education she did not possess. The conversation continued for perhaps 20 minutes, longer than he typically spoke with anyone at such events, and he noticed that she made no attempt to prolong it artificially, did not employ the small strategies he had observed in countless other women, the dropped handkerchief or feigned stumble that required his assistance, the questions designed to flatter, or the comments calculated to demonstrate accomplishments, and when the music changed and her cousin approached to introduce her to another guest, Eleanor excused herself with natural grace, leaving him standing alone near the windows, disturbed by how much he had enjoyed speaking with someone who appeared to want nothing from him beyond the conversation itself, who had looked at him not with the assessment of his title and fortune, but with the simple attention one intelligent person gives another. And as he moved away through the crowded ballroom, he carried with him the unsettling realization that he was already anticipating their next encounter, already hoping she would attend the next ball he was obligated to grace with his presence, and this hope felt dangerous in ways he was not yet prepared to examine. The weeks that followed established a pattern that became as predictable as the changing of seasons, for at every ball the Duke of Ashworth now attended with unfailing regularity, a transformation noted by all of society with varying degrees of surprise and speculation, and within minutes of his arrival, his gaze would sweep the room until it found Eleanor Hartfield in her lavender silk, always standing slightly apart from the crush of guests, and he would make his way to her side with the purposeful stride of a man who knew precisely what he sought, and their conversations became the feature of each evening that both anticipated with an intensity neither would have admitted aloud, discussions that ranged from literature to philosophy to the practical concerns of estate management, topics that would have bored most young ladies to tears, but which Eleanor engaged with genuine interest born of her father's scholarly influence and her own keen intelligence. The lavender dress appeared at each successive ball, its fabric growing thinner despite Eleanor's careful preservation, the color fading further under the relentless exposure to candlelight and the small stresses of movement. And gradually the whispers began, quiet at first but growing in volume as the season progressed, about the girl in the worn gown, who had somehow captured the attention of the most eligible and least attainable man in London. Speculation that ranged from sympathetic to cruel, depending on the observer's nature, with some suggesting she must possess extraordinary wit or beauty to compensate for her obvious poverty, while others darkly hinted at impropriety or calculation. Lady Pemberton, hearing these whispers and concerned for her cousin's reputation, approached Eleanor one evening before a ball with gentle diplomacy, suggesting that perhaps it was time to accept assistance for a new gown, that she would be honored to provide the fabric and her own seamstress's services as a gift freely given between family, but Eleanor refused with quiet firmness, explaining that she could not accept charity she had no means to repay, that the lavender dress served its purpose adequately, and to pretend otherwise would be a dishonesty she would not embrace. And this conversation took place in the anteroom, where guests left their wraps, unaware that the Duke had arrived early and stood just beyond the doorway, and he heard every word of Eleanor's refusal, heard the pride and principle in her voice, and his respect for her deepened into something more complex and dangerous, an admiration that was beginning to transform into feelings he had never expected to experience. At the ball that followed, they found themselves in a quiet corner after the second dance, and their conversation turned to abstract questions of duty versus desire, speaking in philosophical terms about the obligations one born to family and position against the pull of personal inclination. And though neither mentioned their own circumstances directly, the subtext lay heavy between them, Eleanor speaking of how duty often demanded sacrifice of happiness, while the Duke countered that surely duty included the obligation to one's own integrity, to live according to one's deepest convictions rather than society's arbitrary expectations, and both knew they were no longer discussing abstractions, but the very real question that hung unspoken in the air between them, the question of what might be possible if convention could be set aside, if the barriers of fortune and station could be overcome by something as ephemeral and powerful as genuine connection. And when the evening ended and Eleanor departed in her cousin's carriage, she carried with her the memory of how the Duke had looked at her during that conversation, with an intensity that suggested his interest had evolved beyond intellectual companionship into territory that both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The Duke of Ashworth sat in his study 3 days after the last ball, surrounded by ledgers that required his attention and correspondence that demanded responses. Yet he found himself staring at the same line of figures for the third time without comprehension, his mind returning with stubborn persistence to the memory of Eleanor Hartfield's voice as she had spoken of duty and desire, in the way candlelight had caught the threadbare patches in her lavender silk and transformed them into something almost luminous, and he rose from his desk with an exclamation of frustration that startled his valet Henderson, who had entered with fresh linens and now regarded his master with the knowing expression of a servant who had witnessed 30 years of his employer's moods and recognized this particular agitation as entirely unprecedented. Henderson mentioned, with the careful neutrality that characterized his observations, that His Grace had attended more balls in the past 2 months than in the previous 2 years combined, a comment that the Duke acknowledged with a curt nod before dismissing him, and when he was alone again he forced himself to examine honestly what was happening to him. This growing preoccupation with a woman who possessed nothing that society deemed valuable, no fortune to merge with his own, no powerful family connections to strengthen his political position, no prestigious lineage that would satisfy his mother's expectations for an advantageous match. And yet he could not deny that in Eleanor's presence he experienced something he had never felt with any of the suitable young ladies who had been paraded before him season after season, a peace that came from being seen rather than assessed, and from conversing with someone who engaged his mind rather than calculating how to capture his title. He told himself firmly that this fascination was merely the novelty of speaking with an intelligent woman, and that it would fade once he properly attended to his responsibilities and selected a bride from among the appropriate candidates. Yet even as he formed these rational arguments, he knew them for the lies they were, knew that what he felt when Eleanor looked at him with those clear eyes was not mere intellectual appreciation, but something far more dangerous and transformative, something that made him question assumptions he had held since boyhood about the proper ordering of marriage and position and duty. That evening his mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived unexpectedly at his London residence and found him in the drawing room, attempting to read a treatise on agricultural improvements that held none of its usual interest, and she settled into the chair opposite him with the confidence of a woman who had managed a duke's household for 40 years and saw no reason to request permission. Now, observing that he seemed distracted, and she assumed he must be contemplating which of the season's debutantes he would choose, perhaps Lady Arabella Thornton with her considerable fortune, or Miss Catherine Wexford, whose family's political influence would prove valuable, and the Duke listened to his mother's cataloguing of suitable candidates with growing irritation until he could bear it no longer, and informed her with barely controlled civility that he had not yet made any decisions regarding matrimony, a response that caused the Dowager Duchess to regard him with sharp intelligence and remark that indecision was unlike him, that something must be troubling his thoughts, and though she did not mention Eleanor Hartfield by name, the Duke recognized in his mother's penetrating gaze an awareness that his preoccupation had not gone unnoticed by those who knew him best. Eleanor stood before the small mirror in her modest room the evening of the next ball, fastening the worn lavender silk with fingers that trembled despite her efforts at composure, and she forced herself to acknowledge what she had been denying for weeks now, that the Duke of Ashworth's consistent attention had awakened feelings she had no right to harbor, feelings that threatened the careful equilibrium she had maintained since her father's death, the acceptance of her reduced circumstances, and the determination to preserve her dignity within them. She knew with painful clarity what she was and what she was not, knew that she had nothing to offer a man of the Duke's position except the pleasure of conversation, and even that seemed a presumption, now that she understood how much she anticipated those moments, how her heart quickened when she saw him enter a ballroom, how his voice had begun to inhabit her thoughts during the long days of her work with Mrs. Weatherby, and she told herself firmly that she must create distance before this attachment grew into something that would cause genuine pain, before she allowed herself to imagine impossibilities that could never be realized, for she would not become any man's mistress, no matter how she might feel, and marriage between them was a fantasy too absurd to entertain. At the ball that evening, she positioned herself deliberately on the far side of the room from where the Duke typically entered, engaging in conversation with Lady Pemberton's friends, and accepting an invitation to dance from young Mr. Thornbury, whose amiable mediocrity had never troubled her before, but now seemed almost unbearable, and she had nearly succeeded in convincing herself that avoidance was possible when the Duke appeared at her elbow during the interval between dances, his presence unmistakable even before she turned, and he requested the honor of a waltz with the formal courtesy that belied the intensity in his eyes. Eleanor knew she should refuse, knew that accepting would only deepen the connection she was trying to sever, yet she found herself placing her gloved hand in his and allowing him to lead her to the floor as the orchestra began the opening strains, and the moment his hand settled at her waist, even through the layers of fabric and the barrier of gloves, she felt the intimacy of the touch like a current of electricity, and they began to move together in the patterns of the dance. Neither spoke as they waltzed, the music creating a private sphere around them even in the crowded ballroom, and Eleanor was acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand warm at her waist, her fingers resting in his, their bodies moving in unconscious harmony, as though they had danced together 1,000 times before, and she could not look away from his face, could not prevent herself from seeing the way he watched her, with an expression that suggested he felt this connection as powerfully as she did. And something shifted between them in that moment, some unspoken acknowledgement that what existed here transcended friendship or intellectual companionship and had become something far more profound and dangerous. When the music ended, Eleanor stepped back quickly, murmuring her thanks with eyes downcast, and before the Duke could speak, she turned and fled through the crowd with as much dignity as she could muster, seeking refuge in the retiring room where she pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks and struggled to steady her breathing, and when she finally emerged and rejoined the ball, she avoided his gaze for the remainder of the evening, though she felt the weight of his attention following her like a physical touch. And as Lady Pemberton's carriage carried her home through the dark London streets, the lavender silk seemed to hold the memory of his hands, and Eleanor knew with certainty that she had reached a crisis point from which there could be no retreat unchanged, that she must either sever this connection completely or acknowledge feelings that could lead only to heartbreak, and the Duke, standing alone in the now emptying ballroom, watched the space where she had been, and felt equally unsettled by the intensity of what had passed between them in that wordless dance. Lady Pemberton requested Eleanor's presence in her private sitting room the morning after the waltz, and Eleanor found her cousin seated by the window with an expression of gentle concern that immediately filled her with apprehension, for she had known Catherine Pemberton long enough to recognize when difficult truths needed speaking, and her cousin began carefully, mentioning that she had noticed the Duke of Ashworth's marked attention these past months, and that while she bore Eleanor nothing but affection and wished only for her happiness, she must, as Eleanor's protector, point out that such public notice was beginning to generate speculation of a nature that could prove damaging to both Eleanor's reputation and the Duke's, whispers about what a man of his position might want from a penniless gentlewoman, assumptions that no respectable person should have to endure, and she suggested with genuine kindness that perhaps Eleanor might consider declining the Duke's invitations to dance or converse at future events, allowing the talk to die naturally before it grew into something more harmful. Eleanor listened with her hands folded tightly in her lap, knowing that everything her cousin said was true and proper, that she had been foolish to allow the connection to develop so openly, that propriety demanded she create the distance she had already recognized as necessary, and she agreed quietly that Lady Pemberton was right, that she would take care to avoid giving further cause for gossip, and she spent the remainder of the day helping Mrs. Weatherby with correspondence while fighting against the ache in her chest that accompanied the decision. The next ball arrived 4 days later, and Eleanor wore the lavender silk with a determination to be inconspicuous, positioning herself among a group of matrons and engaging in conversation about neutral topics, gardening and the upcoming autumn season, and the health of various elderly relatives. And when the Duke entered the ballroom, her heart contracted painfully, but she kept her eyes fixed on Mrs. Dalrymple's animated description of her grandson's progress at Cambridge, refusing to look toward where she knew he stood. She felt rather than saw his approach, sensed the moment he positioned himself near enough to request her attention, and when he spoke her name with that particular tone that had come to mean so much, she forced herself to turn with polite but distant courtesy and decline his invitation to dance, explaining that she had promised this set to Mr. Thornbury and the next to Colonel Waverley, inventions that came easily in her desperation to maintain the necessary boundary, and she watched something shift in the Duke's expression, confusion, giving way to a careful blankness that she recognized as the mask he wore when wounded, and he bowed with frigid correctness and withdrew without another word. Eleanor danced with Mr. Thornbury, barely hearing his cheerful chatter, her eyes finding the Duke across the ballroom as he stood alone near the terrace doors, his posture rigid with an anger or hurt she could not distinguish, and then he was gone, departing the ball with an abruptness that caused comment among the other guests, and Eleanor completed the evening with mechanical politeness. While her heart splintered into pieces, she would later gather in private, and when Lady Pemberton's carriage finally carried her home through streets grown cold with approaching autumn, the lavender silk felt heavier than it ever had before, weighted with loss and the terrible certainty that she had done the right thing, even as it destroyed something precious. And she told herself as she prepared for bed that this clean severing was mercy. That brief pain now prevented the deeper agony that would come from allowing impossible hopes to flourish. Yet, as she lay sleepless in the darkness, she could not escape the memory of his face in that moment of rejection, could not convince herself that what she felt was relief rather than desolation. 2 months passed without the Duke of Ashworth attending any London ball, and Eleanor told herself repeatedly that his absence was a relief, that the clean break she had created was exactly what propriety demanded and wisdom counseled. Yet she could not explain to herself why the music at each subsequent ball seemed flatter, why conversations that had once provided pleasant distraction now felt hollow, why she found herself looking toward the entrance, each time the doors opened, only to feel a peculiar emptiness when it was never him, and Lady Pemberton watched her cousin with growing concern, as Eleanor's natural quietness deepened into something closer to melancholy. The light that had briefly illuminated her features during those months of the Duke's attention now extinguished, leaving only pale composure. Mrs. Weatherby noticed as well during their daily sessions of reading and correspondence, and one afternoon when Eleanor's voice faltered while reading a passage about lovers separated by circumstance, the elderly woman set aside her needlework and asked, with the directness permitted by age and affection, what troubled her young companion. And Eleanor found herself confessing the entire situation, the Duke's attention, her own foolish attachment, the necessary withdrawal that Lady Pemberton had advised, and Mrs. Weatherby listened without interruption until Eleanor finished with a statement that she knew she had done the right thing, even if it caused temporary pain. The old woman was silent for a long moment, her fingers still on the embroidery in her lap, and then she spoke of her own youth, of a gentleman who had loved her despite her family's modest circumstances, how she had refused him out of pride and fear that she would be a burden to his prospects, how she had married instead a wealthy man who gave her security but never understanding, and how she had spent 60 years wondering what might have been if she had chosen courage over propriety, love over prudence. And she told Eleanor gently that sometimes what appears to be wisdom is merely fear dressed in respectable clothing, and that she should consider carefully whether she was protecting her dignity or merely her heart from the risk of hope. Meanwhile, far from London at his country estate in Derbyshire, the Duke of Ashworth drove himself through the management of his lands with an intensity that surprised his steward, inspecting drainage projects and crop rotations and tenant cottages with meticulous attention, as though agricultural improvement might crowd out the thoughts that plagued him during any moment of stillness. But everything conspired to remind him of Eleanor, a book of philosophy in his library that he had mentioned during one of their conversations, the slant of evening light through the windows that matched the amber of her eyes, the change of seasons from summer to autumn that she had once described as a kind of beautiful melancholy, and he found himself remembering not grand gestures but small moments, the way she listened with complete attention when he spoke, the intelligence in her questions, the absence of calculation in her manner, and he could not reconcile the genuine connection he had felt with her subsequent coldness, could not determine whether he had imagined the depth of their understanding or whether something else had driven her withdrawal. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived for a visit in late October, ostensibly to review the estate accounts, but actually, as became clear within hours, to investigate her son's obvious unhappiness, for she had never seen him so withdrawn, so mechanically dutiful, without any spark of genuine engagement, and she knew her son well enough to recognize the symptoms of a heart in conflict, though she waited several days before addressing the matter directly. The Dowager Duchess chose an evening when rain fell steadily against the library windows, creating the kind of enforced intimacy that encouraged honest conversation, and she sat across from her son in the chair that had been her late husband's favorite, watching him pretend to read correspondence while his mind was clearly elsewhere. And finally, she set aside her own needlework and spoke his name with the particular tone that meant evasion would not be tolerated, asking him directly whether he intended to spend the remainder of his life hiding in Derbyshire from whatever had driven him from London with such abruptness, and when he looked up with carefully schooled features, she continued, before he could offer some deflection about estate business, telling him that she had not raised a coward and would not watch him become one now over a matter that was clearly causing him considerable suffering. The Duke set down the letter he had not been reading and met his mother's eyes with the honesty she had always demanded, admitting that he did not know what she meant, which was such an obvious falsehood that the Dowager Duchess actually laughed, a sound without much humor, and informed him that she had not spent 40 years navigating society without learning to recognize a man in the grip of thwarted affection, and moreover, she had made it her business to investigate Miss Eleanor Hartfield, not from any desire to interfere, but from genuine concern for her son's happiness and a mother's need to understand what had affected him so profoundly. She watched her son's expression shift at Eleanor's name, saw the carefully maintained neutrality crack just enough to reveal the wound beneath, and she proceeded to share what her inquiries had uncovered, speaking of Eleanor's father, who had been a respected scholar despite his modest circumstances, of his death that had left his daughter without protection or fortune, of the dignity with which Eleanor had borne her reduced state, working as a companion rather than accepting the several offers she had received from wealthy older men who would have provided security in exchange for youth and beauty, and the Dowager Duchess admitted that she had expected to find evidence of calculation or social climbing, some hint that Eleanor was angling for an advantageous match, but instead she had discovered a young woman of genuine principle who appeared to want nothing from anyone except the right to maintain her self-respect. The Duke listened without interruption, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as though anchoring himself. And when his mother finished by asking him directly whether he loved Miss Hartfield, he found he could not dissemble, could not offer the careful political answer he might give to anyone else, and he confessed simply that, yes, he loved her, had tried to reason himself out of it by cataloguing all the ways she was unsuitable by society's measures. No fortune, no connections, no powerful family to advance his interests, but none of it mattered because she was the only person who had ever seen him rather than his title, who had wanted nothing from him except honest conversation, and he feared she did not return his regard, given how completely she had withdrawn from him at that last ball, how she had refused his invitation to dance with a politeness that felt like a blade. The Dowager Duchess was quiet for a moment, considering her son with an expression that mingled affection and exasperation, and then she said something that surprised him, that happiness was far rarer than fortune, that she had been fortunate in her own marriage, but knew many who possessed every material comfort while living in emotional desolation, and she suggested that perhaps he should discover the truth of Miss Hartfield's feelings rather than assuming he knew them, that a woman of principle might have many reasons for creating distance that had nothing to do with indifference, and as her son stared at her with dawning hope, she added that she had not raised him to surrender without at least fighting for what he wanted, and if he truly loved Miss Hartfield, then he owed both of them the courage to pursue the truth, whatever it might be. The Duke of Ashworth returned to London in the first week of November with a sense of purpose that his household had not witnessed in months, and his instructions to his staff crisp and decisive as he ordered his townhouse opened and prepared. And within 2 days he had made the necessary social calls to announce his presence in the capital, learning through careful inquiry that the season's final grand ball, before the autumn exodus to country estates, was to be held at Lord Harrington's residence in 3 days' time, an event that Lady Pemberton and her cousin were certain to attend, given its significance as the closing event of the social calendar. He spent those 3 days in a state of controlled tension, rehearsing and discarding various approaches, trying to determine what he would say to Eleanor if given the opportunity, how he might bridge the chasm that had opened between them through misunderstanding and propriety's cruel demands, and on the evening of the ball he dressed with particular care, his valet noting with satisfaction that His Grace finally seemed engaged with something beyond agricultural reports and estate business. Eleanor had not wanted to attend this final ball, had suggested to Lady Pemberton that perhaps they might forego it given the late season and her own fatigue, but her cousin had insisted with an unusual firmness, saying that one should not end any season on a note of withdrawal and melancholy. And so Eleanor found herself once again in the lavender dress that had become both armor and prison, the fabric now so worn that she could see light through it in certain angles, the careful repairs she had made over 3 years now visible to anyone who looked closely, and she felt a deep weariness as her cousin's carriage approached Lord Harrington's brightly lit mansion, wondering how many more times she would don this gown and pretend that her heart was not quietly breaking beneath its faded silk. She entered the ballroom with Lady Pemberton, automatically taking her customary position near the potted palms where she could observe without participating, and she was adjusting her gloves and preparing herself for an evening of polite conversation with elderly matrons, when she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, and she looked up to find the Duke of Ashworth across the ballroom, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Their gazes held for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time's normal measures, and then he was moving toward her with the purposeful stride of a man who had made a decision and would not be deterred, and Eleanor felt panic rise in her chest because she had convinced herself she would never see him again, had built careful walls around the hurt of his absence, and now those walls were crumbling at the simple fact of his presence. He reached her and bowed with perfect formality, and she curtsied in return, and then he spoke in that voice she had heard in her dreams during the long weeks of his absence, asking if she would grant him the favor of a private conversation in the garden, and Eleanor knew she should refuse, knew that nothing good could come from being alone with him again, but she found herself nodding and accepting his offered arm, and together they walked through the French doors into the moonlit garden, where autumn roses still bloomed despite the approaching cold. They walked in silence for a moment, maintaining the proper distance that propriety demanded even in this semi-private space where other couples strolled and conversed, And then the Duke stopped near a stone bench beneath an arbor of late-blooming jasmine and turned to face her directly, his expression serious and searching, and he said that he must know whether he had offended her in some way, whether some action or word of his had caused her to withdraw so completely, because he had spent 2 months attempting to understand what had changed between them and could find no answer except his own inadequacy. Eleanor felt tears threaten at the pain in his voice. This man who commanded such respect and fear from others, now standing before her with uncertainty written across his features, and she struggled to find words that would be honest without being improper, finally admitting in a voice barely above a whisper that she had withdrawn not because of any offense he had given, but because Lady Pemberton had warned her that his continued attention was causing talk that might damage both their reputations, and she had thought it better to create distance before either of them was hurt by society's censure. The Duke stared at her for a long moment, and then he said something that shocked her with its vehemence, that he cared nothing for gossip, had never valued society's opinion and would not begin doing so now, that the only truth he cared about was whether she had withdrawn from indifference or from some misguided attempt at protecting him from consequences he was perfectly capable of accepting, and Eleanor found herself meeting his eyes with an honesty that frightened her, telling him that it had never been indifference, could never be indifference, but that she had thought it the kindest course for both of them, given the impossibility of their situations. The Duke's question hung in the air between them like something physical, and Eleanor found herself looking down at the lavender silk of her gown, her fingers automatically smoothing a fold where she had mended a tear just 3 nights prior. And she realized that after months of conversations about literature and philosophy and the nature of duty, this was perhaps the most intimate question he had ever asked her, cutting through all pretense to the truth of her circumstances, and she took a slow breath before answering, with the honesty that had always existed between them, explaining that the dress had been her mother's, worn to assemblies in happier times, when her father was alive and their family, though never wealthy, had been secure and content, and after her mother's death, she had carefully unpicked the seams and remade it to fit herself, altering the cut to suit current fashion while preserving the essence of what it had been, and she wore it not from inability to acquire another, though that was certainly true, but because it was the only beautiful thing she possessed that connected her to a time when she had been loved and valued beyond any consideration of fortune or position, and because she would not pretend to be something she was not, would not accept charity she could never repay, would not appear ashamed of circumstances that were the result of fate rather than fault. The Duke listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished speaking he was silent for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised her with its vulnerability, confessing that he had first noticed her precisely because of that dress, because in rooms full of women who changed their plumage nightly like exotic birds performing elaborate mating dances, she alone remained constant and honest, wearing the same gown with such quiet dignity that it became not a mark of poverty, but a declaration of principle, and he had found himself drawn to that honesty, the way a man lost in wilderness might be drawn to a single steady light, and he admitted that he had observed her repairs in the candlelight at various balls, had noticed the expert needlework that kept the fabric presentable, had recognized in those careful stitches the same quality he valued in her conversation, a refusal to accept defeat, a determination to make the best of what one possessed, rather than lamenting what one lacked. Eleanor felt tears threaten at his words, at the revelation that what she had thought must be a source of disdain had instead been the very thing that attracted his notice, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with propriety or caution, and for a moment they stood in that moonlit garden, surrounded by the scent of jasmine and autumn roses, 2 people who had found in each other something neither had expected to discover, and then the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and sudden, breaking the spell of the moment and forcing them to move toward the shelter of the house. But as the Duke offered his arm and they hurried across the wet grass, Eleanor knew that something fundamental had shifted between them, that in sharing the truth of her dress, she had revealed more than mere circumstance. She had revealed her heart, and in his response, he had shown her that he saw not her poverty but her worth, not her limitations but her strength, and as they reached the shelter of the terrace and paused to catch their breath, the rain falling harder now beyond the protective overhang, Their eyes met once more, and in that look was a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together, honest and unafraid. They returned to the ballroom with careful composure, the rain having stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving only the scent of wet earth and jasmine clinging to their clothes. And though they walked the proper distance apart and maintained every appearance of propriety, Eleanor felt as though the very air between them had become charged with meaning, as though every person in the glittering room must surely see the change that had occurred in the moonlit garden. But the orchestra was playing, and couples were forming for the next set, and the Duke turned to her with a formality that seemed almost absurd given what had passed between them, asking if she would honor him with this dance. And Eleanor accepted with a curtsy that felt equally ceremonial, placing her gloved hand in his and allowing him to lead her onto the floor, where other couples swirled in the patterns of the waltz. As the music began and his hand settled at her waist, proper and correct, yet somehow more intimate than any touch she had ever experienced, the Duke spoke in tones so low that only she could hear beneath the violin's melody, telling her things he had never voiced to another living soul, confessing that his position had been a prison of his own making, surrounded always by people who wanted something from him, who calculated every word and gesture for advantage, who saw not a man but a title, a fortune, a stepping stone to their own ambitions. And in all the years since inheriting his duchy at his father's untimely death, he had not experienced a single moment of genuine human connection until the night he first spoke with a woman in a faded lavender dress, who asked nothing of him and gave him the gift of seeing him as simply himself. Eleanor listened as they turned and stepped in time to the music, her own heart opening at the vulnerability in his carefully controlled voice, understanding that what he offered her was not merely affection but trust, the rarest currency among those who lived in society's highest circles. And she found herself responding with equal honesty, admitting in the same low tone that she had valued their conversations and their brief exchanges of ideas and observations more than she had valued anything in the 3 years since her father's death, that she had looked forward to each ball not for the music or the dancing or the temporary escape from her modest circumstances, but for the possibility of seeing him, of engaging in discourse that challenged her mind and stirred her heart, though she knew such feelings were foolish, given the impossibility of their different positions in the world. The Duke's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist, and he said something that made her breath catch, that there was nothing impossible about two people recognizing worth in each other, that fortune and position were accidents of birth while character was the result of choice, and surely she must know by now that he did not value the former over the latter. But before Eleanor could formulate a response to this declaration that seemed to hover just on the edge of something more profound, the music reached its final crescendo, and the dance ended, leaving them standing among the other couples, hands still joined for a moment, longer than propriety strictly allowed. And then the Duke was escorting her back toward where Lady Pemberton stood, with several other matrons, his manner once again the picture of formal correctness. But as he bowed over Eleanor's hand in parting, his eyes held hers with an intensity that conveyed a promise more binding than any words, and Eleanor understood that their conversation was not finished, could never truly be finished now that it had begun, and she watched him move away through the crowd, with the certain knowledge that something irrevocable had shifted between them, and that in sharing their loneliness, they had created a connection that transcended the ballroom's glittering superficiality. And as she stood there in her worn lavender dress with her heart racing beneath its faded silk, she dared for the first time to imagine a future that did not consist solely of duty and dignified poverty, though she hardly dared name the shape that future might take. The package arrived on a grey morning 2 days after the ball, delivered to Lady Pemberton's townhouse by a liveried footman whose crimson and gold livery bore the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Ashworth, and Eleanor was in the small sitting-room, reading aloud to her cousin from the morning's newspaper, when the butler announced the delivery with a discretion that barely concealed his curiosity, and Lady Pemberton's eyebrows rose as the footman placed the parcel on the side table, with a formality that suggested its contents were precious beyond measure, before bowing and departing, leaving the two women staring at the package wrapped in fine paper and tied with silk ribbon. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set down the newspaper and approached the parcel, aware that accepting any gift from a gentleman was a breach of propriety that could damage her reputation beyond repair, yet unable to deny the fierce curiosity that made her fingers fumble with the ribbon until it fell away, and the paper opened to reveal a length of silk so white and fine that it seemed to glow in the morning light, the fabric pooling like liquid moonlight across her lap as she lifted it, and tucked within the folds was a card bearing 3 words in the Duke's distinctive hand. "Wear white tomorrow." Lady Pemberton moved to her side and read the note over her shoulder, and Eleanor heard her cousin's sharp intake of breath, followed by a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and when Eleanor looked up, she found Lady Pemberton's eyes bright with tears and something that looked remarkably like hope. And her cousin said gently that Eleanor must understand what this meant, that a man did not send such a gift, did not choose white silk with such care and intention, unless he planned to ask a question that required an answer, dressed in the color of new beginnings and sacred promises. Eleanor protested that accepting such a gift was impossible, that she could not compromise herself or him by taking something so valuable and so laden with implication, but even as she spoke the words, her fingers stroked the silk with a reverence that betrayed her true feelings, and Lady Pemberton sat beside her and took her hands, speaking with the wisdom of a woman who had navigated society's treacherous waters for 3 decades, explaining that sometimes propriety must bow to possibility, that if Eleanor refused this gift, she might be refusing the very future the Duke was offering. And did she truly want to let fear and convention dictate the course of her life, when happiness might be within reach? The rest of that day passed in a blur of decision and action, Eleanor finally agreeing to accept the gift with Lady Pemberton's enthusiastic encouragement, and as evening fell she found herself in her small chamber with Lady Pemberton's lady's maid, the silk spread across her narrow bed, and she began to cut and pin and sew with hands that had mended her lavender dress 100 times, but had never worked with fabric of such quality, creating a gown of simple elegance that would let the silk speak for itself, her needle moving through the material with the precision born of years of necessity, transformed now into artistry, and she worked through the night by candlelight, while Lady Pemberton checked on her periodically with encouraging words and cups of tea. And as dawn broke and the gown took its final form, Eleanor held it up and saw in its simplicity and grace a garment that was neither pretentious nor apologetic, but honest, much like herself, and she thought of the Duke's note, those 3 words that promised everything and explained nothing, and allowed herself for the first time to imagine that tomorrow might bring not just another ball, but the beginning of a life she had never dared to hope for. The evening arrived with all the weight of fate disguised as ordinary autumn twilight, and Eleanor stood before the mirror in Lady Pemberton's guest chamber, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her, transformed not by artifice or pretense, but by the simple grace of fine white silk that fell in clean lines from her shoulders to the floor, the gown she had sewn with her own hands, now revealing what the faded lavender had always concealed, that beneath the worn fabric and mended seams had always existed. A woman of quiet beauty, her dark hair arranged simply, her only ornament, the slight flush of nervousness coloring her cheeks. And Lady Pemberton stood behind her with tears gathering in her eyes, declaring that Eleanor had never looked more herself, more perfectly and honestly beautiful. And as they descended to the waiting carriage, Eleanor felt her heart beating so rapidly she feared it might be visible through the silk, wondering what the Duke intended or what question he planned to ask, though she hardly dared give name to the hope rising within her chest like dawn, breaking over a landscape long held in darkness. The ballroom was already brilliant, with candles and conversation when they arrived, the season's final grand assembly drawing all of society's most elevated members, and Eleanor hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of every eye that turned toward her, the whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, voices asking who was this woman in white, remarking that surely it could not be Miss Hartfield, the poor relation always seen in that faded lavender gown, but the whispers fell away to nothing when the Duke appeared, crossing the polished floor with a purposeful stride that ignored every rule of protocol and precedent, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he bowed before her with a formality that seemed almost ceremonial, while his gaze held hers with warmth that contradicted the gesture's correctness, and Eleanor sank into a curtsy that felt like an answer to a question not yet spoken, and when he extended his hand and requested the honor of the first dance, a waltz, which by custom indicated particular favor and intention, she placed her fingers in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, while the assembled company watched with expressions ranging from shock to delight to barely concealed envy. As the music began and they moved together in the familiar pattern they had danced before, the Duke spoke in tones meant only for her ears, telling her that white was the color of new beginnings and of promises made and futures claimed, and that he had sent the silk because he had a question to ask, but wanted to ask it of a woman dressed as befitted her true worth rather than her temporary circumstances, and Eleanor's hand trembled in his as she understood finally what this evening meant, what his gift had represented, what his careful attention over these months had been building toward, and she felt tears threatening though she blinked them back, not wanting to miss a single moment of this dance, this conversation, this transformation from woman overlooked to woman cherished. And as they turned beneath the chandelier's light that caught in the white silk and made it shimmer like moonlight on water, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that perhaps the impossible might be made possible, that perhaps worth could be recognized across the divides of fortune and position, that perhaps love might indeed prove stronger than convention, and the Duke's eyes told her without words that her hope was not misplaced, that what came next would change everything. And as the waltz concluded, and he led her from the floor toward a quiet alcove where they might speak in privacy while remaining visible for propriety's sake, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to divide into before and after, and that the woman who had worn the same lavender dress for 3 years out of necessity and pride was about to step into a future she had never dared imagine, but had perhaps always been meant to find. The alcove was set into the wall beneath a portrait of some long-dead ancestor whose stern face seemed to watch over them with disapproval that the Duke ignored entirely as he led Eleanor to the velvet-cushioned seat positioned to allow conversation in relative privacy while remaining visible to the ballroom's occupants. Propriety maintained even in this moment that felt suspended outside ordinary time, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling while the Duke remained standing for a moment, looking down at her with an expression that held both determination and something that might have been vulnerability. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying none of the flowery phrases or practiced sentiments that characterized most proposals, but instead the same directness that had marked all their conversations, and he said that he had thought carefully about what he wished to say, had rehearsed various speeches in his mind, but found that in her presence all artifice fell away, and he could only speak truth, which was this: he loved her mind that challenged and engaged his own, loved her dignity that refused to bend even under the weight of circumstance, loved her principles that would not compromise for convenience or advantage, and he acknowledged that by the world's measure he brought far more to this potential union than she did, and that she had no fortune or connections or influential family to recommend her, but he argued that by any measure that mattered, they were equals. For what was fortune compared to character? What were connections compared to genuine regard? And he wanted not an ornament to display, or a transaction to benefit his estates, but a partner to walk beside him through life, a companion whose conversation he would seek in his last hour as eagerly as he sought it now, and if she could find it in her heart to accept him, he would count himself the most fortunate of men, regardless of what society might say about the inequality of their circumstances. Eleanor sat motionless as he spoke, tears gathering in her eyes, though she fought to maintain composure, and when he finished, she found her voice trembling as she gave voice to the fears that had haunted her since she first recognized her feelings for him, saying that she brought nothing to this marriage, no dowry or property or useful relations, that she would face scorn from society as a fortune hunter who had trapped a duke above her station, and that his family and peers would view her as an unsuitable choice who might damage his standing and influence. And how could she accept his offer, knowing she would bring him nothing but her own poor self, knowing that love might not be enough to overcome the practical realities of their different positions, knowing that he deserved a bride who could match his consequence rather than diminish it? The Duke listened to her fears without interruption, and when she fell silent he knelt before her so that their eyes were level, a gesture that would have scandalized observers had any been close enough to see clearly, and he took her hands in his with a gentleness that contradicted the strength she knew lay beneath his careful touch, and he said that she brought everything that mattered because she brought herself, brought the woman who had worn the same dress for 3 years without apology or shame, brought the woman who had refused advantageous offers rather than compromise her integrity, brought the woman who saw him as a man rather than a title, and as for society's opinion, he had never valued it, and would not begin now, for he had learned through painful experience that fortune and position brought everything except happiness, and he would rather face scorn beside her than approval beside anyone else, and he asked her again, simply and directly, if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, of allowing him to spend his life, proving that he was worthy of the gift she would be giving him. Eleanor felt the words rise within her, like a tide that could no longer be held back by fear or propriety or careful reason, and she looked into the Duke's eyes as tears finally spilled down her cheeks and said yes, yes, she would marry him, that she had fought against loving him because it seemed impossible and foolish and destined only to bring pain. But she could not deny what her heart had known, perhaps from their first real conversation, that she loved him not for his title or his fortune or his position, but for the man he was beneath all those trappings, for his mind that challenged hers, for his directness in a world of pretense, for the loneliness she recognized in him that matched her own, and if he truly believed she could be the partner he needed, then she would spend her life proving him right, would stand beside him through whatever scorn or speculation their marriage might bring. And her voice broke as she finished speaking, but her gaze never wavered from his, and the Duke's face transformed in that moment, the careful control he maintained in public, falling away to reveal joy so profound it seemed almost painful, and he drew a shaking breath as if he had been holding it throughout her answer, and from his waistcoat pocket he produced a small velvet box that he opened to reveal a ring set with a sapphire, the deep blue of evening sky, surrounded by small diamonds that caught the candlelight, and he told her it had been his grandmother's, the only piece of her jewelry he had kept, because she had been the one person in his family who had understood that happiness mattered more than duty, and he asked if Eleanor would do him the honor of wearing it, and when she extended her trembling hand, he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there, and for a long moment they simply sat in the alcove with her hand in his, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just transpired, before the Duke rose and helped Eleanor to her feet, and together they walked back into the ballroom where the music still played and the dancers still turned. But everything had changed, for their linked hands and the protective way the Duke stood beside Eleanor, and the ring visible on her finger, announced to all observers what had occurred, and the reaction rippled through the assembly like a stone cast into still water, shock and speculation, and whispered calculations about what this meant for the Duke's consequence and Eleanor's fortune. But there was also genuine happiness visible on some faces, Lady Pemberton's satisfied smile suggesting she had hoped for exactly this outcome, and across the ballroom the Dowager Duchess caught her son's eye and offered a small approving nod that spoke of blessing given, and as the evening continued and Eleanor danced in her white silk gown with the sapphire gleaming on her hand, she felt herself transformed, not by the ring or the proposal or even the fine fabric she wore, but by love itself, by the knowledge that she was seen and valued and chosen, not despite her circumstances, but because of who she truly was. And the Duke never left her side for the remainder of the ball, and his hand at her elbow, or claiming hers for each dance, making clear to all of society that Eleanor Hartfield was under his protection now, and would soon bear his name. And when the evening finally ended, and he handed her into Lady Pemberton's carriage with a bow that held both formality and tenderness, Eleanor knew that the woman who had worn the same lavender dress for 3 years out of necessity had been forever left behind, replaced by a woman who wore white silk and sapphires, and carried in her heart the certainty that love had found her worthy after all. 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparations that Eleanor insisted be kept simple despite the Duke's position requiring certain formalities, and on a crisp October morning, when the leaves had turned to gold and amber and the air carried the scent of approaching winter, Eleanor stood in the small dressing room, adjacent to the chapel on the Duke's country estate, and looked at herself in the mirror, wearing the white silk gown she had made months ago, now enhanced with delicate embroidery she had added during the intervening weeks. Tiny flowers and vines worked in silver thread along the neckline and hem in patterns her mother had once taught her, and Lady Pemberton stood behind her, adjusting the simple veil of Brussels lace that had been the Dowager Duchess's gift, and Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she touched the sapphire ring she had not removed since the Duke placed it on her finger, and Lady Pemberton said softly that Eleanor's father would have been so proud to see this day, to know his daughter had found not just security, but genuine love. And then it was time, and Eleanor walked through the corridor to the chapel, where autumn light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the stone floor, and she saw the small gathering of witnesses, Mrs. Weatherby dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, the Dowager Duchess sitting in the front pew with an expression of satisfaction, and then her gaze found the Duke standing before the altar in his dark coat, his face turned toward her with such open emotion that her breath caught, and she walked toward him without hesitation, without doubt. And when she reached his side and he took her hand, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told her he was as moved as she, and the ceremony began with the chaplain's voice speaking the ancient words about love and commitment and the joining of two lives. And when the Duke spoke his vows, his voice was steady and clear, promising to honor and cherish her, to stand beside her through all the seasons of their lives. And when Eleanor spoke her own vows in response, her voice rang with certainty, promising the same, and the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife. And the Duke lifted her veil with gentle hands and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of both passion and reverence, and the small group of witnesses applauded as Eleanor and the Duke turned to face them as husband and wife, the new Duchess of Ashworth, and the wedding breakfast was held in the estate's small dining room, with its windows overlooking the gardens, where late roses still bloomed. And the Dowager Duchess raised her glass in a toast, welcoming Eleanor as a daughter, and acknowledging that her son had chosen wisely, had found a woman whose worth transcended fortune. And as the afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor and the Duke departed for the privacy of the ducal apartments, their honeymoon to be spent here on the estate rather than travelling, and in the quiet of their chambers, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the last light faded from the sky, they came together with a mixture of nervousness and tenderness, learning each other beyond the formal boundaries that had constrained them in public spaces, discovering the intimacy of touch and whispered words, and the profound vulnerability of bodies joined as their hearts had already been joined. And Eleanor fell asleep that night in her husband's arms, the white silk gown carefully laid aside, and knew that the girl who had worn the faded lavender dress had been transformed not by wealth or position, but by love itself, by being chosen and cherished for exactly who she was. 5 years had passed since that October wedding in the small chapel, 5 years during which Eleanor had transformed from impoverished gentlewoman to Duchess of Ashworth, yet the transformation had been one of circumstance rather than character, for she remained fundamentally the woman who had worn the lavender dress with quiet dignity, still spending her mornings reading to elderly shut-ins, though now she arrived in a well-appointed carriage and could offer material assistance as well as companionship, her position allowing her to establish a charitable foundation that provided support for impoverished gentlewomen who might otherwise face the same uncertainties she had once known, and the Duke's estate had flourished under their joint management. His lands improved by practical suggestions Eleanor had gleaned from her father's agricultural studies, the crop rotations and soil amendments that increased yields and improved the lives of tenant farmers. And there were children now, 2 daughters, and a son who filled the great house with laughter and brought softness to the Duke's features when he lifted the youngest into his arms. Children being raised with both privilege and principles taught that wealth carried responsibility and that human worth transcended fortune. And on this particular autumn afternoon, Eleanor sat in her private sitting room where weak sunlight filtered through tall windows, wearing a simple day dress of fine wool but without ostentation, her taste still running toward understated elegance rather than the elaborate fashions many duchesses favored. And in the drawer of her writing desk, the lavender dress lay carefully preserved in tissue paper, not as a relic of hardship, but as a reminder of the journey that had brought her here, of the dignity she had maintained when dignity was all she possessed. And she was reviewing household accounts when the door opened, and the Duke entered as he often did in the quiet hours between obligations, and still seeking her company and conversation above all others, even after 5 years of marriage. And Eleanor looked up from her ledgers with a smile that came as naturally now as breathing, and he crossed to her chair and bent to kiss her forehead before settling into the chair opposite. And they spoke of small things and large ones, of the children's lessons and estate business, and a letter from Lady Pemberton, who remained a beloved friend. and the Duke's eyes held the same warmth they had held on their wedding day, perhaps deeper now, for having weathered the small storms and large joys that 5 years together had brought. And Eleanor thought how strange it was that she had once believed love to be impossible for someone in her circumstances, how she had convinced herself that dignity and independence were enough, when in truth she had simply not yet met the man who would see past the faded dress to the woman beneath, who would value her mind and her principles more than fortune or connections. And the Duke reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the sapphire ring she still wore, and in that gesture Eleanor felt the accumulated weight of 5 years of partnership and passion and profound companionship, the kind of love that had been built not on the fever of infatuation, but on genuine regard and shared values and the daily choice to honor and cherish each other. And she knew with certainty that the girl who had stood at the periphery of ballrooms in a worn lavender dress could never have imagined this happiness, this sense of being completely known and completely loved. This life she now lived as the Duke of Ashworth's wife and partner and the mother of his children, transformed not by wealth or position but by love itself. The London season had arrived again, and the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth hosted a grand ball at their residence as they did each year, the ballroom ablaze with candlelight and filled with the cream of society, and Eleanor stood near the refreshment tables, wearing a gown of white silk that echoed the dress she had worn the night her husband proposed, though this one was far more elaborate with its overlay of delicate lace and trim of seed pearls, and she watched the season's debutantes with compassion born of memory, seeing in their eager faces and calculated smiles the same hopes and anxieties she had once observed from the periphery, and her gaze was drawn to a young woman standing alone near the far wall, perhaps 20 years of age, wearing a gown of pale green muslin that had clearly been mended at the shoulder and let down at the hem, a dress worn too many times and showing the strain of it despite obviously careful maintenance, and Eleanor saw in that young woman's careful posture and dignified bearing an echo of herself years ago, and she crossed the ballroom with the easy grace of one who had long since ceased to doubt her place, and when she reached the young woman, she introduced herself simply and asked if they might sit together for a moment, and the young woman's eyes widened with surprise that the Duchess herself would seek her company, and Eleanor engaged her in conversation, not with condescension but with genuine interest, asking about her family and her interests, and learned that the young woman's father had been a clergyman recently deceased, that she lived now with relatives and attended balls only through their charity, and Eleanor felt her heart contract with recognition and reached out to touch the young woman's hand, and said that she understood more than might be apparent, that she too had once known what it meant to stand at the edges in a dress that had been worn too many times, and the young woman's eyes filled with tears of gratitude for this unexpected kindness, and across the ballroom the Duke watched his wife with the same expression of enduring love he had worn for 5 years, seeing in her compassion and grace all the qualities that had first drawn him to a woman in a faded lavender dress. And Eleanor glanced up and met his eyes and smiled, and in that exchange was the whole history of their love, built on genuine regard and sustained by daily choice and deepened by years of partnership and passion and profound companionship. Dear listener, perhaps you have learned from Eleanor and the Duke's story that true worth cannot be measured in silk and jewels, that dignity maintained in hardship reveals character more surely than wealth ever could, and that love built on genuine connection transcends the accidents of fortune and circumstance. In a world that too often judges by appearance and values wealth above principle, may you have the courage to see past the surface to the person beneath, to recognize that the worn dress may clothe a spirit of greater worth than all the fresh gowns in the ballroom, to understand that patience and genuine regard build foundations stronger than passion's fever ever could. May you find, as Eleanor and the Duke found, a love that chooses you not for what you possess but for who you are, a partnership built on respect and shared values and the daily choice to honor each other. May you have the wisdom to recognize such love when it appears, even if it comes in unexpected form, even if it requires courage to embrace it. And may you know that dignity and principle, maintained through seasons of hardship, prepare the soil in which the deepest happiness can grow. Rest well tonight, knowing that worth is intrinsic and love sees what others overlook. If this story has touched you, subscribe to Eternal Tales for more narratives of love that transcends circumstance and courage that transforms destiny.